Hi, I'm Catherine Hellerstein, and I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program at Penn and a professor of Yiddish literature in Germanic Languages and Literatures department. I'm here to welcome you this evening to the 24th annual Patricia Brown Silvers and David Silvers Visiting Scholar program, which this year takes the form of a very special symposium on revolutionizing American Judaism, the Jewish counterculture in the 1960s and the 1970s. It's hosted by the Jewish Studies program and co-sponsored by the Department of History and the Department of Religious Studies, whom I thank. On the handout, you will welcome information about the Silvers Visiting Scholar program, including a list of some of the luminaries that we've had as our speakers over the past 23 years. And without further ado, though, I'm going to introduce the moderator of our symposium, Professor Beth Wenger, the Moritz and Josephine Berg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania and Associate Dean for Graduate Studies in the School of Arts and Sciences. So.
Thank you. So I'm going to be as brief as I can before getting the program going. I want to say thank you to Catherine, to the Silvers family, and to Patty, who's here with us tonight, for endowing the program. And I should also say for supporting this particular project, as you see in the donors list. So this is our formal rollout of Penn's Jewish Counterculture Oral History Project. And actually, this project tackles just one aspect of the Jewish counterculture, and that is the Chavurah movement. For those who don't know, I think most of you in this room do, but I'm not making assumptions. So the term Chavurah actually derives from the Hebrew word chaver, which means friend. It would loosely translate Chavurah as fellowship, although that doesn't really do it justice. For our purpose, the Chavurah, or Chavurot plural, were, as we wrote on the handouts, truly revolutionary groups designed to reinvent Jewish community. In the 1960s and 70s, as you'll see and hear this evening, groups of young Jews who mostly grew up in the suburbs rejected the sterility and the formality of institutional Judaism, and instead they innovated new forms of prayer and study and communal life, where they emphasized spirituality, engagement with texts, and political activism. The origins of this oral history project began when Michael Strassfeld, who you'll hear from a bit later, donated his papers to the Penn Libraries. Together, Michael, myself, and Arthur Kieran, who is the Schottenstein-Jesselson Curator of Judaica Collections here at Penn, decided to complement Michael's collection, and by the way, the photos are all from that collection, decided to complement it with an oral history project that would document the Chavurah movement through the memories of those who created it, or at least a small group of those who created it. We loved the idea from the start, but to be frank, we had really no idea what we were doing. Luckily, we partnered with Jayne Guberman, who you'll hear from in a few minutes as well, who is an experienced oral historian who showed us the ropes and conducted all the interviews that you'll hear, together with Noam Osband, who was our videographer. And the two of them created the film that you'll see in a few minutes. We were also fortunate to have Penn undergraduate Clara Phillips as an intern on the project, and she helped us get the written transcripts into shape and also made a short film of her own that is preserved on our site. And more about that site. On the handout, you'll see many links to the site. And I want to say we were very lucky to have wonderful people in the library, not only Arthur, but also Kenny Whitebloom, who oversaw all the technical details of building the platform. And I want to stress that this site with the videos, the searchable transcripts and films are all open access. The idea is that we're going to publicize this widely. We want people to learn about this movement, to use these sites. We made a film like this in part so people can teach from it. So we're very happy to make this very, very widely known and accessible. I also just want to say a couple words of thanks, and then I'm going to shut up, to Talia Fishman and Catherine Hellerstein, the former and current directors of the Jewish Studies program, who agreed to be our partners in the project while we were conceiving it. And finally, a special thanks to the narrators themselves, who generously shared their stories with us. 3 of them are here. One is Michael Strassfeld, also Chava Weissler, who's right there, and David Schneer, who is right next to her. So you'll see a little bit of them too. And of course, to the donors who made this possible, you'll see their names listed on the program, and also Penn's program in research on religion and urban civil society was a great donor to the project at the end when we really needed the funds. So here is how our program will go this evening. First, we're going to screen the film. And the film has excerpts from the oral histories. It's the only way to give you a real sense of what the oral histories are like. And we really want to do that. It's about 30, 35 minutes. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Michael Strassfeld, with Jayne Guberman, and with Riv-Ellen Prell, who you do not see here in person because she's been under the weather, but after the film runs, I promise you she can hear me, and we'll bring her up remotely for her comments as well. So one last thing, especially for those of you who aren't as familiar, there are unfamiliar words, Hebrew, a little Yiddish in this film. Ask us afterwards, we'll define them. I think you'll get it in context, even if some of the words are a bit unfamiliar. So with that, I'm sitting down, and we're gonna screen the film.
עץ חיים היא למחזיקים בה עץ חיים היא למחזיקים בה עץ חיים היא לשלום עץ חיים היא לשלום
So we walked in the front door, and towards the back on our right was a room with a straw ark and cushions on the floor, no other furniture in that room. People were quietly meditating on the cushions. And then after a while, somebody began a very quiet nigun, and I was just, it was the most astonishing thing. It was exactly, I was home. I was exactly where God intended me to be.
We started Chavorot because synagogues were too big and alienating and
lifeless.
We looked down on American bourgeois values, including the American synagogue, which was this bourgeois place, the ladies with the mink coats and the rich guys who would show up once a year. That was what the American synagogue was.
We were creating a new form of Judaism that was, in our eyes, better than what we had grown up with. So the idea of shaping it ourselves to our own needs, out of our own encounter with tradition, was profoundly attractive.
I know I was seeking to have a place where the search for Kedusha and sacred community and my political concerns were shared. I thought that would be, I mean, it does come from that impetus, and I think you're in the 60s, that sort of create the commune, create the small, intensive, intimate community.
I like to say that I walked into JTS with, in one pocket of my jeans, a copy of Allen Ginsberg's Howl, in the other pocket, a copy of Lev Yitzhak of Berdichev, and both were equally unwelcome at the seminary. I said, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to start a different kind of Jewish community. There has to be a Jewish community for people of our generations that will have different values.
There was no longer a draft deferment for graduate school.
In the spring of 68, when I knew that I didn't have a deferment, that I needed a deferment, that graduate school would not be my deferment, I think by letter, he contacted me, telling me about his plans, their plans, to start this alternative rabbinical school.
Now, not everybody joined for a deferment, but many people did.
And for me, this was immediately about Jewish learning. It wasn't, the draft deferment was an excuse, a way to get people to do this. Why would people take a year or take a couple of years to do this? Well, it was getting them out of the draft, but I was interested in getting people to create some kind of alternative Jewish community. I didn't know exactly what.
It was called Chavurat Shalom Community Seminary. I remember my mother saying she didn't like that name because it sounded like I was going to a community college.
We thought of ourselves as an intentional community. And again, there would be a lot of discussion and debate about what intentional community meant. But at the very least, it meant that we all lived in proximity to each other.
There were communal meals once a week. There was meeting once a week. There were retreats at least 4 times a year. Shabbat services, Friday night. And there was an expectation that you would volunteer to do stuff. Cleanups and planning stuff. And so it was very clear this was going to be the center of your lives. This community was going to occupy the center in the middle of your life.
But I don't think they were so interested in Israel at the time. I just don't think it was. It wasn't so important to them. It's what George said in the beginning of the interview. You know, it was more what they were going through at the time that was important. It was more about religion and spirituality and learning, and not about Jewish peoplehood.
To be a member of the Chavurah means when you land at Logan Airport, you can call anyone on the Chavurah list without embarrassment and ask them to come pick you up. That was the position paper. And then I remember once getting a call from Joel Rosenberg, who was at Logan, said, "Could you come pick me up?" I was so happy that he called, because I could fulfill my duty, it's kind of my mitzvah, of picking him up at the airport. And I didn't want to say no, even though I knew I was allowed to say no, because he had, you know, sort of checked off the box there of what you're allowed to do.
What had happened was a kind of rebellion inside Jews for Urban Justice from people who were more interested in religious expression and less interested in political expression. So Rob Agus, who was the son of a rabbi, knowledgeable, and thought of himself as a conservative Jew in a new framework. Went to the local UJA and said, "We need some money to do this." And no question, largely because of my father's reality, the presence, they took it seriously. And they gave us $15,000 for the first 6 months.
His vision was to create a Jewish counterculture center. I think that was the terminology he was using at the time, in Washington, D.C.
We attracted a very wide group of people, some of whom knew stuff about Judaism and some of whom knew almost nothing. Right. And that was fine with us.
And then we needed a building. So it's on Florida Avenue, 2158 Florida. And that building was used by Roman Catholic sisters. They were so happy to be doing this. You know, they thought it was thrilling that we were making use of this facility.
Rob Agus picked Farbrengen. And he didn't know any Yiddish, so he didn't know it was Farbrengen. And he named it after the meeting of Hasidim with the Rebbe. That's what a Farbrengen is in Hasidism. In fact, there was a joke, how come we misspelled, it's supposed to be Farbrengen? And Rob said, well, there are 2 reasons. The earthly reason is I called my mother and asked her how to spell it, and I misheard her over the phone.
But the heavenly reason is that that R is for Rebbe, and we don't have a Rebbe.
Chavarat Shalom had been created in the fall of '68. So word of it was all over. And that was about smaller community and studying in different kinds of ways.
What I remember as the kind of self-identity, at least of the New York Chavurah, was that it was going to be a place where the people that you prayed with would be the people that you studied with, would be the people that you did politics with. That's the way we always defined ourselves.
Chavarat Shalom was heavily associated with art, and I think Farbrengen was heavily associated with author. Waskow. And I think New York Chavurah didn't have someone like that, for good or for bad. I think we thought it was for good, but there's nothing about it. Was just a different model.
What characterized New York Chavurah especially was our monthly retreats, and that was really different.
Every single month, we went away on a retreat for Shabbat. We would leave Friday afternoon, come back Saturday night.
That's very intense. I mean, just the organization. At each retreat, there would need to be a coordinator. That requires location, transportation, food, tefillah, discussion.
We did Kabbalat Shabbat Friday night. That's when we davened. If we davened, we'd Kabbalat Shabbat Friday night. Shabbat morning, we would daven together. We would have conversations late into the night. We would have study sessions. We would walk. We would play, whatever. But sort of being part of that and building community was a really big piece of it.
A very distinct memory I have from the first retreat we had was, I think it was lunch on Shabbat, and we were finished eating, and I said, I kind of like banged on the table and said, let's bench. And all of a sudden, everyone looking at me as if I had presumed to carry over a tradition that I took for granted, rather than opening up for questioning about whether we should.
To be a full-time member of the Chavurah, you had to be taking, if I remember rightly, 3 courses. And those 3 courses would meet for 3 hour and a half sessions during the week.
I, of course, was very seduced by the prospectus for the Chavurah, which had a whole list of courses that I was very interested in. There were courses in Jewish mysticism, courses in Hasidism, in the Song of Songs, in Kabbalah.
The emphasis in the Chavurah curriculum was on the mystical / agadic side of the Jewish tradition.
Intense study, but more personal, spiritual, seeking, theologically open kind of study. The kinds of questions you didn't ask in university classroom, and you didn't even ask in the JTS classroom.
When Everett Gendler came the second year, he taught a course on Jesus and the Gospels, which I took. And again, this was like, what? We are studying Jesus and the Gospels at a Jewish seminary. This is fascinating.
People who were teaching classes would be sitting next to you in a class, themselves taking a class the next day. And that's a very powerful message. The message is that we are a community of learners. You can have something to teach the group, but you're also going to be, another time you're going to be a learner in the group.
I had some knowledge of stuff from reading Gershom Scholem, reading some other things, but I didn't have knowledge of texts, And here we were sitting around discussing a text. I say, oh, this is something. This is a new kind of experience.
It was the best use of traditional text that I have ever experienced. It wasn't to learn and know more. It was to know each other.
We had classes there. I taught Hebrew, I think. Can't remember exactly what else. We had classes in Hebrew, in Siddur, in Talmud, Yiddish when Max came.
And there was a sculpture class at night, and there were workshops on all sorts of ideas. I taught one on Judaism, socialism, and anarchism.
Trying to live in relationship to the tradition, not just halachically, but spiritually. What did it mean? What did the Torah have to say to us? What did later writings have to say to us about you know, how we should live our lives, about what the life meant, about how to structure our lives.
Right. You know, and of course, and we had to invent our tefillah. What was it going to be? It was not at first egalitarian. It would slowly become egalitarian. But again, the natural move was men would lead. But, you know, how we would pray, which siddur we would use, what we would include and not include, how much English, how much Hebrew, because the group was, you know, was quite varied in terms of their backgrounds.
We experimented a lot with what we call creative liturgy. And that meant playing Stravinsky in the background, and it meant reading poetry. I thank you, God, for this most amazing day by E. E. Cummings. Must have been read 100 times until we got sick of it, because that went with Yotzer Or, went with the miracle of the day.
If somebody wanted to try something, they were given the opportunity to try something.
I mean, the fact that we were, you know, that David and I could imagine bringing, you know, bringing Bach to Shabbos morning was like, oh, you know, there are things here that could be meaningful to us if we figured out how to engage with them.
Somebody would say, you stop the service and say, you know, today I thought that we would sing this prayer because it's the 4th of July and we want to think about what does it mean to be an American in our times with the war and all this stuff. And we would sing to this tune. We're going to introduce this tune. Or we're going to say, add a special reading on.
No, I actually remember one Shabbat service that was all silent. I don't know what we did, but I think it was all silent.
What was going on was David Schneer leading Friday night Psalms. I mean, leading Kabbalat Shabbat.
And we're doing Hasidic Nugadim interspersed with readings. You know, sometimes I would pass around Martin Buber's 10 Hasidic rungs and pick out a teaching from Martin Buber.
I like the dancing. I like the you know, as Durkheim would say, the effervescence.
And it was kind of, you know, kind of the right balance of music, okay, the emotive, you know, and also the intellectual, the thought. We're trying to be careful not to. There was very little talking, you know. It was mostly, you know, listening and singing, chanting.
And the thing that was amazing about Chavarat Shalom that I've never seen anywhere else is when we began a nigun, we didn't end it after you know, singing it twice through and then you stopped. We continued the nigun until the nigun came to its natural close. When it was the time for it to end and the group subsided from the nigun, that's when the nigun ended.
Kakotz gefällt mir nicht, Kakotz geht man, weil Kotz ist doch beim Koim HaMikdash, Kotz ist doch beim Koim HaMikdash, Kakotz darf man eule Regel sein, eule Regel sein.
Neo-Hasidic was like it. It took elements from Hasidic prayer, but it had a kind of modern Americanized spin to it.
It was Hasidism combined with Heschel, combined with Buber, combined with just the sort of cultural quest for intensity in our age, in our generation.
There was an intentional appropriation of what wasn't ours. Eastern Europe wasn't ours. The melodies there was an intentional appropriation, and then it became ours through the Chavurah. In other words, it became what was characteristic. It was one of the first forms of true American Judaism. We were creating an authentic form of American spirituality, in some ways on the fly, but in relationship with a traditional source.
Shabbos morning, we used to say, that's our service to the Jewish community. And literally the service to the Jewish community. And there we had a lot of people would come. And anybody could come. And as we became famous, we kind of got, you know, sort of tourists, you might say, Jewish tourists would come to Chavarat Shalom.
What our Shabbos morning was mainly about for a long time was simply, as you've probably already heard, reading the Parsha aloud in English and stopping to discuss it. And whenever anybody has something they want to talk to, they stop and say, it's not just the person who's reading, anyone could say, and this is the classical Chavurah locutions, I have problems with this. I have problems with the fact that you have legal slavery. I have problems with the sexism in this story. I have problems with the ethical implications of being charged to murder the Canaanites. We tried to understand the difficult parts by coming up with interpretations.
Yeah, there was a feeling that we should be meeting across our local lines because we had a larger platform to look at, larger sense of what our agendas should be and what we might be exploring with one another to look at. So that's where Weiss's Farm began. And the conversations were just amazing.
The first Weiss's Farm was Sukkot of 73. So it was amazing. I mean, it sort of made clear that this was not just an idiosyncratic thing that we were doing in Washington.
Camp people are camp people forever. So the extent to which many people in the Chavurah had shared Jewish summer camp, much of it Ramah, not entirely, the retreat approximated that.
I had a sense of the Chavurah as a movement, not as just my personal journey. I had a sense of Chavurah. Early on, absolutely. Because it seemed to me such an amazing model for the Jewish community. How could we not have seen ourselves as pioneering an entirely new Judaism? You know, one that was going to not be the failed Judaism we knew, but a successful Judaism of engagement.
Liz Colton, one of the New York people, told me, oh, it's clear. The Boston people are the mystical Chavurah, the New York people are the academic Chavurah, and you in Farbrengen are the political Chavurah, which fit who we were and where we were and like that.
The Chavurah Summer Institute, which exists to this day, came out of Weiss's Farm. You know, it was a bigger venue for Weiss's Farm.
We had the Farbrengen Fiddlers that David put together were played at these events.
The Farbrengen Fiddlers, I guess, might be probably the first, if you want to give us a place in the archives, probably the first Jewish counterculture, band. This record has grown out of the coming together, that's what Farbrengen means, of creative talents in an atmosphere of new Jewish discovery and rediscovery, of a tradition once thought lost and of a future once thought abandoned. Shiru Ladonai Shir Chadash, it is a new song we are singing. Those words I also set to music and became like the theme song, I guess, of the early Farbrengen. Shiru Ladonai, Shiru Ladonai, Shiru Ladonai Shir Chadash, Shiru.
The Jewish catalog, of course, is a very important evolution of Chavurah culture. A lot of the definition of Chavurah, I think, comes from the Jewish catalog, and it's its major expression.
There were, 20 of us out in the backyard trying to figure out how to put up a sukkah. And, as I said, it's a bunch of Jewish guys who didn't know which end of the hammer to use, And I said at the time, I said, there should be a Jewish whole earth catalog that you look into and you get instructions on how to build a sukkah.
Richie's decided to try and do it. George didn't want to do it. Sharon said, oh, she'd help out, and I joined, so there was the three of us.
As the whole earth catalog demonstrated, there were lots of people who were interested in this kind of reappropriation of the tools and resources of life to empower and revivify their experience.
As like part of the charm of the catalog is like the picture of the
younger people, they look like every other American kid that age. Like you wouldn't know that they're Jewish, right? And that was part of the charm and the importance, as I said earlier, of you could be completely contemporary. It wasn't like you had to give up living in America in 1970 to be part of the Jewish thing.
When my son, he went to a magnet high school, and we were trying to figure out what he could do Jewishly before he could start prose door in 8th grade. And I thought, no big deal. We'll get a bunch of kids who stopped day school, in 8th grade, and we'll have a study group. And, I started calling around parents of Schechter School kids who were out and saying, we have a group. And they were responding to me like I was some kind of lunatic who had called them up on the phone, create your own class for a kid? What are you talking about? And I realized that I was totally a Havra Jew, that to me it was obvious that if you had a Jewish need, you created what you needed to fulfill it. And in a sense, that's what Jewish feminism has been, is taking the power to define and redefine Judaism. So I see them as completely feeding into each other.
The New York Havurah, much earlier than the Boston people, accepted women as independent members. The Boston Havurah, I think Havurah Shalom initially, the only way a woman could be a member was if she was married to a man. But there were a couple of single women in the New York Havurah. And women's membership was officially taken seriously and equally.
Pretty quickly there was a women's group formed, which had a lot of the, probably in 72 or 73, there's a women's group formed that had a lot of the energy of the community in it. And then there was another women's group formed afterwards.
The Havurah. It was already egalitarian space, and in that sense it was a base from which we could go out. But I don't think we were yet imagining, demanding more substantive changes that we would bring to the Havurah.
Right. And I don't think the men saw that as in any way threatening. I mean, we were just doing our thing, and they were already egalitarian, so, what was the big deal?
It was, from the get-go, egalitarian for women and men. It was a basic principle. In fact, when we met the Havurah Shalom people, we were shocked at how male it was.
I think we were a little blind to the fact that it was basically a men's group and there were a few women sprinkled in.
We also wanted to be fully equal members. It didn't work, and it didn't work in part because I don't think most of the men cared about that very much.
When we started, there was no seminary ordaining women. So the idea that women would be members, first thing, they weren't going to be drafted. Second thing, whoever heard of a woman rabbi? So both of those things were off the table.
My experience in the Havurah was that women's voices were not suppressed, but they were not heard as powerfully as men's voices were. I don't think I'm looking back and coloring it. I think that was accurate. I didn't feel unfree to say whatever I wanted.
So we generally had this feeling that we were at the crest of openness and egalitarian sharing, and it never crossed our minds until questions came up about how we would handle halachic questions. We considered ourselves really at the forefront of that kind of openness, and I think a lot of people would have shared that at that time. It's just somehow Mona said we were clueless.
It was a weird balance. If I had something to say, I felt like people listened to it. If I spoke in a class, I felt like people heard what I had to say. But I don't feel like I was ever a decisor and a deciding voice in the group.
We didn't need to advocate for changes in Farbrengen. We had what we needed. but we wanted to know more. We were very, I can't remember what year Ezrat Nashim was, but we...
71 or 2.
Yeah, I think we were very proud to hear about that. We cheered our sisters on.
It started as a class within the New York Chavurah, and then Ezrat Nashim, I think Ezrat Nashim always saw itself as part of the New York Chavurah, even though it, in a sense, grew beyond it.
By the time I came back to New York in '74, Ezrat Nashim was kind of CR group, women's talk group. We did the baby naming ceremonies booklet at that point, but it had really stopped being an activist group. But we definitely thought of ourselves as part of the New York Chavurah.
We never wanted to create a package. This is how you create a Chavurah in your community. We never wanted to be what we call the Holy Mother Church of the Chavurah movement. That sounded repulsive to us. We believe that each Chavurah has to arise spontaneously out of its own situation and the needs of its own people. And I think that was a mistake. We might have spread the ideal of Chavurah more widely had we been less averse to public relations and organization of effort and things like that.
Utopia means that, it's a flash in the pan, but it creates a model of what's possible.
The Chavurah movement is a blip on the screen of Jewish continuity and Jewish community, and yet it is also something that's had profound impact in very significant ways that are actually unidentifiable throughout the Jewish world.
The American synagogue has become a much less formal and pretentious place. It's a place where the values of community are taken much more seriously in a good synagogue, and where the rabbi is much more a facilitator of community than she was ever trained to be in those days.
In other words, all these independent minyanim that sprang up as you can trace it back to Chavrat Shalom. You absolutely can. The understanding about why Jews study, not in the Orthodox community, but in the non-Orthodox community, that came from Chavurah. That's where that came from.
And it's interesting to see, if you look at the people that came out of New York Chavurah and Farbrengen and Chavurat Shalom that ended up running stuff in various ways, the way that their Chavurah experience either influenced those institutions, or at any rate influenced the people and the way they thought about those institutions.
I think the model of participatory kind of do-it-yourself Judaism, which was so critical to us and which we found so fulfilling and enlivening, is still alive and well. I mean, in New York, you've got Mechon Hadar, you've got Altshul, you've got all these different, kind of like Chavurot who think they've created it, who think they came up with the idea of it.
So in many ways, my whole life has been shaped by the Chavurah years. My whole project, I sometimes define my project as what I call creating a seeker-friendly Judaism. Creating a Judaism that welcomes seekers and has room for seekers and people with more questions than answers and so on, and saying, yes, you too belong in this tradition and have a place in it and can be leaders of it because you're one step ahead of your people around you in seeking, not because you have all the answers. And all of that really is language I would have used already in the Chavurah.
All those people who said to us back in the 70s, you're going to destroy the Jewish community, you're taking all the future out of it. No, in fact, they saw that we had something that worked, and they started imitating it. So synagogues all over the country have created what they call chavurot, which are smaller groups that, of some sort or another, they do different things in different synagogues, but they enable people to form communities and feel connected.
The Chavurat Shalom and then the subsequent Chavurot tapped into something very profound in American Judaism that was missing. Number one, we needed more intimacy, like a shtibel. Number two, we needed to rescue or come back to a more experiential, emotional, and nigun-based a kind of exploratory approach, as opposed to the sort of, basically for many people, it was a dead experience going to synagogue. And I think in many different ways, and most people have no awareness at all that this is connected to Chavarat Shalom, the whole Chavurah movement is an attempt to create more intimacy, more relevance, more depth. And some of them are study sessions, some of them are davening, some of them are eating, some of them are socializing, raising the kids together. To me, that's all good, right? In other words, the whole notion that the Chavurah movement and other independent minyanim have tapped into the need for intimacy and spiritual exploration that was really missing at that particular historical period.
It legitimated a way of being Jewish in our culture that other people then adapted to their own needs. And the adaptations are considerable, but I still see them, let me just give the Temple Israel example. The fact that at Temple Israel, before they have their large service on Shabbat morning, every week they get together in small groups to study Torah is important, is an important manifestation of this sort of trend.
I take great pleasure in that, actually. I think it's not only enriched our lives, but I think it has made a real difference in the larger American Jewish community without people necessarily saying, oh yeah, that goes back to Chavarat Shalom. And I don't really care about the attribution piece, but I do think that it made a difference and has made a difference. And I think from an ongoing perspective, the Chavurah idea is very important, that people feel sustained and nourished Jewishly at all these different levels.
Shiru l'Adonai, Shiru l'Adonai, Shiru l'Adonai, Shir Chadash. Shiru l'Adonai, Shiru l'Adonai, Shiru l'Adonai, Shir Chadash. Shiru l'Adonai, Kol haaretz. Shiru l'Adonai, Baruch Hu Shemo. Shiru l'Adonai.
And we hope it'll be just the beginning of these kinds of efforts. So now, you see, let me call up Michael Strassfeld, Executive Director of the project, Jayne Guberman, our oral historian, and over my shoulder, still recovering, Riv-Ellen Prell, Professor Emerita at the University of Minnesota. And I'm not giving people long introductions. The reason we gave you the handouts with the bios is so we don't have to waste time with that. So I've asked them all to speak just about 10 minutes. We're going to start with Michael, who not only donated his papers as a co-author of the Jewish Catalog, but is a founding member participant of Chavarat Shalom, and we're going to start there, then go to Jayne and talk about her experience doing the oral histories, and then we'll go to Riv-Ellen Prell, who has written her earliest book about the Chavurah movement and many works on gender and American Jewish history, as you see before you there. So, Michael, why don't you get us started?
It's a little bit of a challenge because in the instructions was to saying, like, don't assume that people in the audience know about Chavurot and Chavurah, et cetera. And I'm sure that's true of some people in the audience, but there are also a number, of familiar faces. And I was very much struck listening to listening to what we just saw, which I've seen at least 3 or 4 times, but in many ways, what I'm going to say will echo a lot of what you have already heard. So, as an early participant in the Jewish counterculture, I want to share that perspective as an insider, as it were. The context of the Jewish counterculture, which you could tell from its name, was the American counterculture of the 60s and the 70s. As a minority in America, Judaism was and is deeply influenced by the surrounding much larger culture. Judaism doesn't initiate significant cultural changes, and yet it doesn't simply adopt those changes and put a kippah, a skull cap, on them and say, poof, now that is Jewish. Therefore, I hope to explain what the Jewish counterculture was and also how it differed from the American counterculture. As you know, the American counterculture was a critique of American society, or at least its perception of that society. It found America too staid, too stuck with old roles and mores, too repressive and too out of touch. And the counterculture affected politics, dress, food, hairstyles, music, and sexual mores. Psychedelic drugs were a part of the counterculture. It challenged authority and the establishment. Freedom was an important word, as in free speech and free love. Woodstock and Vietnam, SDS and hippies. It was a time of great ferment in America. The Jewish counterculture was not as all-encompassing as the general counterculture, in part because those involved in the Jewish counterculture were also part of the American counterculture. The Jewish Catalog, a work that gave expression to the Jewish counterculture, as I said just a moment ago, was illustrated with photos of young Jews who looked indistinguishable from other people in the 60s with long hair and flowing, colorful clothing. The truth is, American Jews for decades had looked like other Americans, with the exception of the ultra-Orthodox community. And similarly, Jews were not smoking pot or living together despite not being married because of ideas or values created by the Jewish counterculture, but because they had already embraced the 60s and its values. What the Jewish counterculture did was challenge the nature of Jewish life in America. Like the American counterculture, it found Jewish life staid and boring. It criticized the values of the American Jewish community, especially that of the suburban life, which it could be argued had become the prevalent form of Judaism in the 1950s. Think of Philip Roth's depiction of that life in his fiction. Like the critique of America as being hypocritical about its values, the Jewish counterculture found the Jewish community as mostly paying lip service to a Judaism that had little significance in how that older generation lived their lives. And in response, as we've heard, the Chavarot were formed by young Jews. I don't know if it's already been told, like it means fellowship, I'll skip that part. There were small groups numbering between 20 and 35 people. There was no rabbi or paid leadership, though some rabbis were members of the group. Intentional communities meant that being in relationship with each other was a key component of the Chavarah. It was not just a bowling league or a book-reading group. It strived to be a community. This, in and of itself, was a critique of synagogues, which was seen as too large and impersonal. Each Chavarah group had its own emphasis, again, as Arthur Waskow said and I won't repeat from the film. But all the groups shared some measure of the aspects of religion, politics, study, and certainly community. And that community, as Sharon said in the film, involved regular communal meals, retreats, and a shared responsibility for the group's running and leadership. The Chavarot shared many aspects with groups in American counterculture, but one difference is that none of them were communes, which were part of the landscape of the American counterculture. The back to the land movement or the communal sharing of property had only a little resonance in the Jewish counterculture. Yet the most significant difference between the Jewish and the wider American version was its relationship to the past. The American counterculture rejected what existed and strived to create a new and better future, radically different from what existed at the time. On the other hand, the Jewish counterculture sought to reconnect to an older and more authentic Jewish culture that had existed in the past and we thought got lost in the coming to America. While sharing a rejection of the present, the Jewish counterculture looked to regain a past rather than trying to build a radical new future. But let me quickly add that the more authentic past needed to be adapted and changed to be in consonance with the contemporary present. For example, Hasidism, the mystical movement that began in the 18th century, became a crucial source for ideas about spirituality. Those texts, the Hasidic texts, were in consonance with the spirituality that was beginning to be brought from Eastern religions, such as Buddhism, and translated for the American setting. Like Americans looking to the East because they could not find spirituality in Western religions, we too looked East, but only as far as Eastern Europe, to a Jewish tradition of spirituality that had been basically forgotten by American Jews. And yet, we also rejected much of Hasidism, its commitment to halakha, Jewish law, the role of the spiritual master, the Rebbe, the secondary status of women, etc. At the same time, some of the critique of the current state of Jewish affairs were more deeply rooted in the present than in the past. As was said, I was one of the editors of the Jewish Catalog, which was an attempt to write down a description of this new Jewish life that we were living, and to provide the resources to others who might want to live such a life. The book's subtitle was A Do-It-Yourself Kit. There was much in Jewish life, the current Jewish life of the time, that rested upon others doing for you or you doing for others, but in neither case, you doing for yourself. In synagogue, the rabbi and cantor would lead Sabbath services while the congregation sat in decorum-laden, dead silence. In the Federation philanthropic world, Jews would generously give money to support Israel or to save Soviet Jewry, but didn't consider that Judaism was meant to be lived by them, by their studying Jewish texts or celebrating Shabbat, the Sabbath, or holidays. We maintained that Judaism needed to be lived not vicariously, but wholeheartedly. Let me conclude with some thoughts on the significance of the Jewish counterculture. After all, the number of people that were actively involved in those years in the Jewish counterculture only numbered in the hundreds. Like all revolutions, we thought the Jewish community would be radically changed by us. In many ways, it wasn't. Yet I believe the impact was important and ongoing. Let me acknowledge that it is always difficult to know whether the Jewish counterculture created the change or it was just an expression of the change that was happening. To use the catalog as an example, was the book a response to the need for a resource for Jews who wanted to live a fuller Jewish life, or did it actually encourage people to feel that need? Either way, the Jewish catalog sold over 300,000 copies, obviously demonstrating a broad interest by the Jewish community in a different kind of engagement in Jewish life. The more participatory style of chavarot, which we heard so much in the film, became the style of synagogue life, with a move away from cantorial solos to communal singing and to rabbis being more informal in style. Synagogues started chavarot as a way to encourage smaller units of community within larger synagogues. A national organization was founded until today, runs a week-long summer institute devoted to the study of Jewish text. The stress on spirituality became increasingly a part of Jewish religious life through healing services, meditation, and a focus on one's inner qualities known as musar. There was a flourishing of the academic study of Judaism, partly led by people who had been members of Chavurot. There was also a growing commitment to learning by lay people through such programs as Wexner and Meah. Less noticed, but as Michael Paley mentioned in the film, but also important, was a style of study that could be described as spiritual. It focuses less on acquiring knowledge and more on the idea that study of Jewish texts can provide meaning to your life. I believe that a major source for that mode of study was the Jewish counterculture. Finally, the importance of social justice as an aspect of Jewish life has many sources, but certainly was a part of the values of the Jewish counterculture in the context of the turbulent 60s, but has continued, and if anything, social justice has had a resurgence even before the current political situation. Finally, I'll take the liberty of a personal note. We live in disruptive times in America and the world, even more disruptive, I believe, than the 1960s. As I suggested, American Judaism changed a lot through the influence of the Jewish counterculture and other forces such as feminism. Yet I believe that much more change is required as the institutions of Jewish life are broadly in decline today. The creativity and willingness to go in new directions while remaining deeply connected to the Jewish past that was characteristic of the Jewish counterculture is what is needed if Judaism is going to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to Jayne, who, if you read her bio, you see is a Penn alum, trained here in folklore. And as I said in the beginning, we were very, very lucky to find Jayne, who could tell us how properly to conduct oral histories.
Thanks, Beth. So I don't know about you, but I'm still feeling very much in the sort of aura of the film and the voices that we just heard of some of the men and women we interviewed for the Jewish Counterculture Oral History Project. And in the video, we see them as they are today. Many of them among the leaders of American Jewry. They're scholars and rabbis, educators, and thought leaders and heads of major Jewish organizations. But the video captures a moment in time, a moment when we sat down, and as you can see, in almost every case, in their book-lined studies or living rooms or dining rooms, with the video cameras rolling to record their stories about a formative time in their lives a half a century ago. And through these interviews, we wanted to capture a rich and nuanced sense of who they were as American Jews back then, in the late 1960s and 1970s, and how the worlds in which they grew up, which we've been talking about, and which Michael just spoke about so eloquently, helped shape them, and why they were attracted, each of them, to this radical experiment we came to call the Chavurah. So I was also struck, as I was looking at the photos that were up on the screens around us earlier, how evocative they were of that time, and also of the fact that we tried to gather photos from our narrators themselves of the particular period that we were focusing on, which is just before most of these photos were taken. So here are just a few more words about the moment in time that we were trying to capture with them. So as you saw, many of them had scraggly beards and long hair when they gathered in Cambridge just over 50 years ago, the first cohort of Chavurat Shalom. And they had been drawn together that fall and spring, actually in the summer, spring and fall of 1968 by Art Green, who was a newly minted rabbi who had been ordained at JTS, gotten through sort of by the skin of his teeth through the mentorship of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and had decided, as you heard, to found an alternative rabbinical assembly. seminary. They were mainly young, they were single, and at Chavurat Shalom, they were all male, for the reasons that I think Barry Holt mentioned there. Some of them were interested in becoming a new kind of rabbi, some were trying to avoid the draft, and some were involved in scholarly pursuits at area universities in the Boston area. And all of them had a serious interest in exploring Judaism and Jewish life with fresh eyes. They were followed the next year in 1969 by a group of young men and significantly a few women at that point who formed the New York Havurah, and in 1971 by another group in Washington, D.C., who came together to found Farbrengen. So just to capture that moment when that first cohort gathered in Cambridge in the fall of '68, the Vietnam War was still raging. The draft was about to be instituted in a widespread way. Student protests were erupting on campuses all across the country. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had both been assassinated just the year before, and Israel had won a decisive victory in the Six-Day War. It was the age of the counterculture, of drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and the stirrings of a feminist consciousness were beginning to change attitudes and relationships in the wider world, and in the Jewish community were quickly leading to a radical rethinking of women's roles and Jewish life, which you heard some of just now. Our project was to document these experiences and reflections of this founding generation of these first three Chavurot, each of which was distinctive in its own way, but yet shared a lot in common, through creating an oral history archive that focused on the first 5 years of this Chavurah experiment. So 1968, with the founding of Chavurat Shalom, to 1973. And I was the lucky person who got to be the oral historian for this project. So in 2016 and 2017, together with our wonderful videographer, Noam Osband, I traveled up and down the East Coast and conducted 25 interviews with 32 people, because 7 of them were members of couples, where both members were part of Chavurot early on, in New York, Boston, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and the greater Washington area, and with people who flew in from Israel, from Chicago, and California. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about this collection of interviews as an oral history archive. Because after all, if you want to gather this story, why not just pull together the papers, the photos, and other traditional artifacts that are the mainstay of many historical collections? Well, in my view, because oral history is uniquely suited to this kind of complex endeavor, and luckily Michael and Beth and others thought so too. Why oral history? Because it cares about documenting historical periods and events through gathering the perspectives of individuals who were participants in those events, or who otherwise have unique vantage points. So, like the Chavurah almost itself, oral history interviews are intimate and personal, and they unfold in a very collaborative encounter between the narrator, the person who's sharing his or her story, and the oral historian, the one who's guiding the conversation through a series of well-designed questions and attentive listening. And its value, to quote the Oral History Association's self-description, quote, lies largely in the way it helps to place people's personal experiences within a larger and historical context. So in our oral histories, we wanted to know what it was about each of the narrators' individual backgrounds and states of mind that drew them to participate in these experimental communities. What had they found to be missing, as Michael was just discussing, in the Jewish communities from which they'd come? What were they seeking, and what was their vision of what they were trying to create? We also wanted to know how the times, in particular, all this business of cultural and political and personal revolution in the 60s, had shaped their sense of themselves, of the broader society, and of their experiences within their Jewish communities. And of course, we also wanted to know about their actual experiences within the Chavurah. What had worked for them, what did they struggle with, and how had their experiences in the Chavurah shaped their own lives? And you heard some echoes of all of that in the brief vignettes that we pulled together. And it's worth noting, by the way, as Beth said, I think this was about 34 minutes. I think there's well over 100, between 100 and 125 hours of oral history interviews in this collection. So all of these questions and many more went into a topic guide, which allowed us to take a deep dive into each narrator's personal life experiences and memories. But the goal of the project went beyond gathering the stories of individuals. We also wanted to draw a portrait of who these young people were as a group and how the Chavarot that they created jointly reflected this radical reimagination of Jewish prayer, teaching and learning, and social activism, all within the context of intensive, self-reflective Jewish communities. Those are all their terms, the ways in which they expressed what they were about. So the topic guide, which was personalized for each individual, also served to allow us to ask about a similar set of topics across all of the different interviews and create this kind of a group portrait. In documenting these beginnings, the tension between the stories and memories of the founders as individuals and the collective portrait they painted of life within the Chavarah was an important and ongoing element. And this multivocality, as we call it, was indeed part of the point, as well as one of the key strengths of oral history as a methodology. Everybody's story matters, and everybody's story contributes to drawing a rich and nuanced collection. Several things struck me of the many, many I could mention today, but that I want to just mention now. One was, it was striking in this context to see how the narrators actually relied on each other to fill in gaps in their collective history, whether because of lapses in their own memory that occur as we all get older, or simply knowing that somebody else could tell that piece of the story better. And throughout the interviews, they referred to each other by name, they mentioned each other's contributions and talents, and they suggest specific individuals I should ask about certain topics. Just to give a few examples, I was told to ask Steph Krieger about how his efforts to avoid the draft figured in the political activism of the first year or two at Chavarat Shalom, or ask David Schneer, everybody said this to me, whose song leading and liturgical compositions were such a prominent feature of Farbrengen, and about the role of the arts within the Chavarah and the larger DC Jewish community. Everybody said, ask Richie Siegel and Michael Strassfeld and Sharon Strassfeld about how the Jewish catalog, which many, many of them had contributed to as writers of different sections, came into being, and on and on. I think it's also noteworthy how the narrators, perhaps because many of them were also still enmeshed in decades-long friendships with each other that had taken root during this very early period in the Chavarah, took care to exercise discretion in talking about each other's private lives, about which they knew a great deal. They found ways, for instance, to talk about the role of drugs in the Chavarah, certainly about changing sexual mores and the feminist, sort of feminist sensibilities around that, and other personal relationships without mentioning names or providing much in the way of revealing information. But there are also ways in which such multivocality can sometimes be seen as problematic. If you ask 32 people about their memories of a particular event, you're going to get 32 different responses, and they're not always in sync with each other. So to give you one example of a discussion I had with virtually every narrator at Chavarat Shalom, we talked about the evolution of a feminist consciousness within this period when Art Green described in the very early years, meaning year 1, year 2 of Chavarat Shalom, as pre-feminist. It was a pre-feminist moment. By the time Farbrengen was founded, it was not an issue at all. It was a consciously and from the beginning egalitarian enterprise. But how did that happen at Chavarat Shalom? And so I asked every single one of them virtually what was the first time a woman did this or that or the other thing, including being counted in a minyan. So in terms of that question, there was general agreement that it occurred on a retreat when a member, clearly a male in those days, needed a minyan to say Kaddish for a parent who had died. And there were 9 men and 1 woman present at very early in the morning for morning prayers on this retreat. And the members whom I spoke to disagreed about what year that happened. Was it the first or second year? Who was saying Kaddish? Who the woman was, although she remembered. And how the decision was actually made. What everyone does agree on is that from that moment forward, this was considered a settled issue. By the way, what they did was they asked the man who was saying Kaddish if it was okay to count the woman. He said yes, and that was it. Not a characteristic way that Chavarat Shalom made decisions, weighing the halachic issues in every problematic that was presented to them. And from that moment on, women were routinely counted in the minyan at Chavarat Shalom. So this incident brings into high relief the issues that we face in anytime we rely solely on an individual account of a larger historical phenomenon. And it's a clear strength, I think, of a collection like ours that the multiple perspectives we find in the oral histories provide for a far richer and more nuanced portrait than any one person's narrative can provide. And even better, these oral histories are now part of an archive that also holds scanned vintage photographs that we were able to collect from the narrators, as well as other contemporary documents to supplement the interviews. And they're all part of the narrator's permanent files within Penn Scholarly Commons, which is the university's open access institutional repository that you can all now have access to. So in this environment, where various sources can be easily accessed and compared, the oral histories will be able to play a vital role, we hope, in creating new understandings of the Chavurah as a formative piece of 20th century American Jewish history. And just as a final note, beyond the scholarship, if you like listening to remarkable life stories, as I do, here in the narrator's own voices, you're in for a real treat, and it was my privilege to help gather these stories, and I hope you'll find them as fascinating and moving as I do when you listen to them. Yep.
Thank you. And finally, Riv-Ellen Prell, who's recovering, but nice enough to be with us remotely, was one of the first people to actually conduct scholarship on the Chavurah through her own ethnography. So you read her bio, it's very impressive. But more impressive are her words. Riv-Ellen?
Thank you. First, I want to begin by congratulating Michael and Beth and Jayne and Arthur, who created the project and saw it through to this remarkable point. And I very much want to thank Chrissy Walsh and Beth for figuring out a way to let me be here as I recover from pneumonia. So I'm actually going to read this because I'm afraid of Beth, and she said how limited the amount of time was I had.
Everyone's afraid of me.
Yes. As you listen to these narrators tell the story of the communities they helped to create and which created them, I hope the dates caught your attention. 1968, 1971, 1972. You would also conclude that these were people then born in the mid to late 1940s. As much as these are stories of individuals creating innovative Jewish communities, religious, political, and social, they are also the story of a generation, the baby boom, born between 1946 and 1954, give or take a few years, who came of age in a period of massive change from the late 60s through the 1970s in the United States and much of the world. They are also specifically the stories, of course, of the Jewish baby boomers. Following a high point of anti-Semitism in the United States during the war years, American Jews, albeit within limits, experienced unprecedented acceptance, particularly in the new suburbs where they moved after the war, and some realized new affluence. Baby boomers, by no means all middle class nor suburban, were nevertheless raised in a radically different world than their parents or grandparents, whose lives were formed by immigration and economic depression. Baby boom Jews' formative years were lived in a Cold War era of political, racial, gender, and cultural repression amidst affluence for some. Americans were driven to aspire to a norm that idealized a white middle-class nuclear family with a stay-at-home mother that embraced conformity and religion as the best means to triumph over Soviet communism and atomic war. American Judaism certainly benefited from the expectations that families belonged to religious institutions. Denominations and suburban synagogues enjoyed unprecedented growth, driven by the need to educate, amuse, and socialize the young Jews of the baby boom. Consensus based on repression normally has a short shelf life. If its foundations showed cracks even in the 1950s, they were earthquake-sized faults by the mid-1960s. Above all, the civil rights movement, whose forerunners stretched back to abolition and emancipation, demanded that the United States make good on its promise for equality and rights for African Americans. Its leaders, grounded in the Black church and thus committed to the religious basis of justice, used nonviolent protests and the moral authority of suffering and death to demand change. It became a model worldwide for groups to organize for rights based on shared identity. The movement was embraced broadly by American Jews, and baby boomer Jews were certainly shaped by it. The United States' entry into the conflict in Vietnam overlapped the civil rights movement directly and deeply affected this generation whose young men faced the draft. The war dominated university life, where Jews attended in huge numbers. Demonstrations, violent and nonviolent, and strikes thrust this generation into conflict with authority on campus and often in Jewish life that launched a radical rethinking of American exceptionalism. While Jews were disproportionately involved in the left, there were also Jews, as you've heard about, the ones who created Chavurot and a Jewish student movement, who negotiated the counterculture specifically as Jews, like the other groups. For example, Blacks, Chicanos, gays and lesbians, women who drew on their unique identities and in some cases religious sensibility to engage in the call for change. The emerging sense of what it meant to be a young adult in America was grounded in the need to call the nation to account. For the Jewish counterculture, that translated into seeing the institutions in which they were raised as having succumbed to a deracinated version of Jewish history and Judaism. It was time to begin again, not to change American and Jewish institutions, as other generations had done, but to leave them behind, to search for new ways to pray, to keep kosher, to create communities, to educate, and to assert a Jewishness for a new generation. How did they become what one early book called New Jews? Chavurot, I would suggest, were built on three major themes and organizing principles that were common to much of the American counterculture and promised a very new way of creating American Jewish life. Authenticity was one of its most important themes and meant several things for Chavurot. Above all, it addressed what its founders claimed was the emptiness and hypocrisy of American culture and suburban Judaism. Their much repeated term, neo-Hasidism, suggested a search for an earlier version of Jewish life, which was planted firmly in Eastern Europe and unembarrassed by physicality and ecstasy and prayer and a non-Western aesthetic that rejected the Protestant decorum on which synagogue life in America was modeled. It also committed to engagement with traditional texts, which was a fairly new vision to many Jews. The neo in neo-Hasidism was, however, crucial. Authenticity did not rest with traditional authority. and Chavurah seekers were not in search of rabbis or rebbes. They sought out what was meaningful and beautiful to their generation. For Jews, as well as Catholics and Protestants who were also taking up questions about religious worship and the place of tradition, the authentic was dynamic. The Chavurat Shalom service could involve a single nigun, or the New York Chavurah could debate whether or not to say the Birkat HaMazon or pray at all. Authority rested with the self and often in community. It had to feel right. For some, authenticity also involved the Jewishness of political activism. The second key principle was the question of scale. The baby boom generation rejected an impersonal mass society and the aspirations of a consumer world. The Jewish catalog described by these narrators was a great example of this worldview, and one connected to its inspiration, the Whole Earth Catalog. The Jewish catalog taught the reader not only how to build a sukkah, which, by the way, had usually only been in synagogues before that, not in people's homes, but how to bake a challah, make a talit, tie its fringes, or make a seder. It offered the learned and the unlearned how to be a particular kind of Jew, one who did not buy services, but created them with others. The scale was human and related to the American counterculture's commitment to growing one's own food, starting free schools for children, and colleges where teachers and students learned from one another. The message was, we reject the model of the synagogue and seminary and seek instead a new and more self-made, humane vision. Finally, community loomed large in every facet of the countercultural world, and particularly Havurot. Community reflected a longing for deep fellowship, intensity in relationships, rejection of the inward-turned nuclear family or the private couple. Relationships were not instrumental. They were the core, even a way to know and encounter God. A matter as simple seeming as who will pick me up at Logan Airport suggested that people had claims on one another by choice that were as profound as the obligations of kinship. Community suggested holism, not fragmentation. Politics, Judaism, friends were an integrated whole. These ways of organizing and living Jewish life did indeed, like the larger Jewish student movement, have a significant impact on American Jews. So much so that their source and origin is largely forgotten, which made this project quite important. Part of their impact was linked to overall changes in American culture that rejected traditional decorum, a more revered view of clergy, large institutional structures over smaller face-to-face groups, inside and outside of synagogues or churches. Religious hierarchy and traditional teachings about women were under attack, and spirituality emerged full-blown with questioning of authority and the centrality of women. Havurot were a vanguard for much of this in Jewish life. We can trace some of these changes for Jews back not only to these organizations, but the very people who founded and participated in them. As one narrator noted, the individuals who participated, who were disaffected with Jewish institutions, went on to lead many of them, but also to transform them. Seminaries, federations, the National Foundation for Jewish Culture, Jewish Education, and some created new ones and became the bedrock of Jewish studies and feminist scholarship. But there are also ironies to be found. In 1857, when Stephen S. Weiss created Minhag America, the first prayer book to be created in the United States, to supplement Minhag Ashkenaz or Sephard, he believed he had found the definitive approach to prayer for Reform Jews. He abandoned it in the 1890s for the Union Prayer Book, which a Reform Committee created. I would argue that every generation finds its perfect formulation of Judaism. In subsequent generations, when young Jews founded what they called a Minyan movement, or Hadar, which emerged in 2006, they went to some lengths to reject what they viewed as a Chavurah vision and differentiated themselves from their parents. Jewish life is deeply generational, rooted in the time and culture in which it hopefully thrives, impatient to create what is authentic, communal, and meaningful for a particular generation.
Thank you. So thanks for these 3 wonderful reflections. We have just a few minutes for comments or questions, but as Riv-Ellen said, I'm a stickler about time. So really questions, brief comments, not stories. Those are for your own oral history, which you should do. Questions, comments? Yes, please.
In the video and in the comments, there was a lot of conversation about the Chavurah vis-a-vis synagogues. Could you comment on the same dynamic vis-a-vis rabbis? And as a side note, I noticed there was no mention of Response Magazine, and I wonder if anyone might want to speak to that issue, because Response Magazine was a way that the Chavurah impulse reached a lot of us who didn't live in New York or Washington or the places where things were going on, or Somerville for that matter.
So, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned, I'll start with the response. I'm glad you mentioned response. You know, I think that, you know, one of the, I don't want to say frustrations, but one of the limitations of this, that is that we could only do 25 interviews with 32 people, but we were very cognizant that there were many other people who could have been interviewed, as well as there were many other pieces of the Jewish counterculture, including I would say the kind of the literary aspects, both Response and Genesis 2 in Boston and Dafka in Los Angeles. So there were a variety of both arts and music. There's a whole variety of different pieces, and certainly Jewish feminism, which is part of this and larger than this. I mean, that all are part of what was going on at the time, and all of it's worthy of mention, and the whole political piece, and Breira, New Jewish Agenda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the demonstration at the GA in Boston. We could go on. So there are many pieces, and it's just the limitations of what we could do. I would say about the rabbi, I think, I'm not sure what you were specifically asking, but
Michael, let me clarify, to make it shorter. I heard a rejection of synagogues and an ambivalence about rabbis.
Yeah.
Chavurah Community Seminary was presumably training rabbis, if only to keep them out of the draft. So the idea about clergy seems more ambivalent. The idea about synagogue seemed more of a rejection. I don't know if that sharpens the question.
Yeah, and I think that's probably relatively accurate. I don't know really whether there was was there a specific vision? Someone said, I think in the film, that to create a new kind of rabbi. That was the Chavrat Shalom, and I don't know if that was ever how well that was formulated, and that was, I would say, it was unique to Chavrat Shalom in Boston. I don't think any of the other groups thought of themselves as seminaries or aspired for that. I actually, in a different way, agree with the comment that Art Green made about leadership, and I think the sort of the ambivalence or anti-rabbi-ness of the Chavurah and leadership in general did handicap the Chavurah movement from being able to create a variety of institutions that might have happened. But I think there was ambivalence about the rabbi thing, definitely.
Beth, could I add something to that?
Sure, go ahead.
So several years ago, I was very happy to to work to make sure that all of Response magazine was digitized, and it's available on a website at Stanford University through the Berman Center, and it is available. I don't think Genesis 2 is. So just to reiterate what I think Michael was trying to say, this was a very, there may not have been tens of thousands of people involved in it. It was a very large movement that dealt with a great deal of politics, very, very interesting debates about Zionism, and a very important set of communities, intellectual engagements that I think have some parallels actually in the 21st century. Michael Staub wrote a book that looks at many of these debates. Chava Weissler, who I think I heard is there, also wrote a book about Verbringen. So maybe what we can do is get this project to create a bibliography and other links for people who want to have a broader and more expansive understanding of what was a very, very significant movement within American Judaism of that period. I wanted to say one other thing. I mean, in response to the issue. The baby boom generation, of which I am a member, I think uniquely had enormous conflicts with its parental generation, much greater than anything I've seen, not speaking personally, but really sort of in social scientific terms about struggles. And it was true not just for the Jewish baby boom, but for the baby boom in general. This tremendous rage at authority was a big, big part of the baby boom generation for a variety of reasons. And I think that goes a long way toward explaining the issue about rabbis. By the way, as a scholar who's learned a great deal more about the synagogue in the post-war period, I think that the rendering, even by these narrators who are major figures of American life, the rendering of the post-war synagogue, I think, is actually remarkably unfair. And what it meant to the post-war generation of the parents of the baby boom, the pride, the joy they felt in building synagogues and creating communities in opposition, of course, to their immigrant parents, is actually very moving. And there have been things written about it. So their children may have experienced it in that way, but I do not think that is the last word on actually what happened in synagogues of the post-war period.
So I just want to add one quick thing, and Arthur could echo this, and I should say Arthur's ability to conduct this project should not go understated in making this happen. But what happened as we were doing this? We knew we were only doing a slice of the Jewish counterculture. We'd love to do much more. But what happened was we began working, Riv-Ellen helped to create a Jewish counterculture collection at the American Jewish Historical Society. People are beginning to deposit their papers around in many archives and libraries. And what we hope to do, in fact, is, and more with the move to open access, is to allow that information to be shared. And I know people have a lot to say, so.
I want to say one other thing too, which is that the oral histories, this collection of oral histories, does not focus simply on the experience of these 32 individuals within the actual Chavurah. We tried in every case to bring who they were, what their other interests were, what their other involvements were in the Jewish world and in the larger world into the conversation about their lives within the Chavurah and how they all sort of came to bear on what was happening within the Chavurah and their experiences there. There are extensive conversations with a number of different individuals, some of whom were key players in Alan Mintz and others around Response magazine and other publications. There are incredibly detailed conversations, for instance, with John Ruskay and others about how Brei Ra came to be formed in the beginning at least in the same office spaces or spaces that they shared with the New York Havurah, and its relationship to the New York Havurah, to the larger Havurah movement as it was taking place in Weiss's Farm, et cetera, where some of those initial very important and formative conversations took place. So I think part of the issue, and I'm looking at you, Arthur, here, is how to create, some kind of index, something that would allow people to search across these interviews to see what's in them. Just to give you a very quick idea, the way we developed each of these interviews was through an extensive pre-interview questionnaire in which I asked people to speak about what had been important and formative in their own lives. And all of that then went into creating a personalized topic guide for each one of them that brought whatever it was that had been so formative in their own lives and their own activities into the interview itself. So they're very complex stories that get told, and
so I do want to say they are searchable.
Yeah.
I know, Arthur, can you say it really, really fast? Because no?
No, I can't say it fast, and I'm not afraid of you.
Okay. You should be. That's because forget it. That's not.
No, don't try to do this at home, folks. This is a really complex project, and I just really want to, in order to respond to that all of your kind comments and extraordinary work, that, Michael came up with this idea. I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I said, we have to talk to Beth. Okay, Beth said, oh, I love this, but how are we going to do this? And then we put together a group of people. And then, thank God, we found a woman named Jayne Guberman. And Jayne, and together, if you're listening to Riv-Ellen Prell speak about this, these are methodologies that are not familiar to traditional Jewish studies. Oral history and anthropology and cultural methodologies are here on display, and how they fit into a library and then how you can access them are really revolutionary in themselves. And like the Havurah movement, we are not trying to be the Jewish counterculture program. We're trying to model at hopefully a very high level what is required of people who have a share and an interest in this experience, and that other people and other repositories will commit themselves to doing this very hard work and making their materials and resources open for everyone so they can be discovered and shared freely. Without that commitment, but above all, the methodology. I cannot tell you how much I've learned from this group of people about how this project is done, and particularly Jayne. You'd think that something like oral Torah would be a bigger part of Jewish studies, and yet here we have, I've learned so much about what oral history can teach us, and I just want to put that on the table and to thank you all.
So we're really running out of time. Thank you, Jayne. If there are just a couple of comments, and we won't necessarily respond to them, if there's anything you want to...
Someone want to say something here?
Yeah, David. Take the... We are recording this, that's...
Comment, I came up, I'm also representing my partner, Rob Agus, who passed a few months ago, who was the principal founder of the Rev-Ellen community. And his vision was an extraordinary vision, which some of us are continuing. I hope that you can expand on what you've done. What you've done is really, really important. And to hear Riv-Ellen talk about other projects, some of you around the country that have are also taking oral histories and doing this. There's so much more. There's so much more. And I hope that it can be linked. Somehow there can be a link, a network, linking everything that's being done around the country.
Just a quick statement. This program seems to be very East Coast oriented, and as there are mentions, there are other groups that were involved in this flourishing, and one of the earliest one was the Upstairs Minyan at the University of Chicago Hillel with Max and Esther Ticket and Danny Leifer. That started, I think, in '63. And that was a major influence. And then Max and Esther obviously moved to Farbrengen later on. So it's not all on the East Coast.
We know, we chose those three. We hope those places will go out and do their own. And this is going to be the last comment.
So just speaking longitudinally, so I was working in New York as a rabbi. My co-rabbi says to me, she's 18 years younger at the time, I was raised on the Jewish catalog. My wife was part of a chavurah in Baltimore, started as a result of people that were with Zalman, so that's what got her into the possibility of becoming a rabbi in Jewish studies. And what I'm saying is that the results from this go on and on, even if they don't look exactly the same, and even if you can't say, this is a direct result of that and it looks exactly the same. I think, you know, as Riv-Ellen Prell says, it's generational. There are continuing influences, even if we don't see them and they're not obvious. But they're really out there and they affect real people's lives. And I just think it's spectacular that we've done this, and I hope that more, again, like everyone else here, I think I'm saying all the same thing that you're all saying. Like, keep it going. Let's make ways to really make waves with this thing. Thank you so much.
So thank you to the panel, to Riv-Ellen remotely, to Jayne, Michael, Arthur, Chrissy for getting this all together. Thank you all so much.